Tonight, I'm particularly excited to welcome Shushan Avagyan here in Greifswald, even if it's such online format. So dear Shushan, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and I wish I was there in person.
So Shushan is an author, translator, and scholar from Yerevan, Armenia. Her novels include a book entitled and The Women of Zarubyan Street, published in 2006 and 2014, respectively. Shushan has taught comparative literature courses and translation workshops almost for 20 years now. Her articles and translations have appeared in numerous publications, including The Review of Contemporary Fiction, Contemporary Women's Writing, Music and Literature, and Dissidences, Hispanic Journal of Theory and Criticism. She is a translator of Energy of Delusion, a book on plot, Bowstring, on the dissimilarity of the similar, A Hunt for Optimism, and the Hamburg Score, all by Viktor Shklovsky. She has also translated Boris Arvatov's Art and Production. And of course, and we will dive deeper into this in this part, she translated I Want to Live, poems of Shushanik Kurghinian. And today, Shushan teaches at the American University of Armenia in Yerevan. So tonight, a book entitled, the one I'm holding here, will be in the center of our discussion, and we'll turn to other works of Shushan as well. We'll read some of the excerpts from a book in Armenian and English, and closer to the end of the evening, there will be some time for your comments and questions. And without further ado, I would like to point out that the book entitled was written in Armenian in 2006 and translated into English by Deanna Cachoian-Schanz in 2023. It also has a translation into Italian by Mina Slurian. This book is written in a very poetic and metaphorical way. Quotations and associations play an important role in it, and the text is composed of different temporal and spatial layers which overlap in the narration. A book tells a story of fictional encounter between Shushanik Kurghinian and Zabel Yesayan, two early 20th century pioneers of feminist literature whose legacies have been obscured in Armenian history. Their meeting in 1926 is interspersed with conversations between the author and her friend Lara, who are researching the work of Kurghinian and Yesayan in today's Yerevan's archives. And while sifting through censored documents and published works and unfinished drafts, they linger in speculation and piece together lives that have been overshadowed by the Tsarist and Stalin regimes. And between this archival digging, the author imagines Kurghinian and Yesayan in Yerevan. Their intimate dialogue never happened, but it bridges past and present. In this way, one might say that a book entitled is composed by 4 to 5 authors. We have a typist or a writer, her friend Lara, Shushanik Kurghinian and Zabel Yesayan, and of course, a reader. So this novel unfolds in 26.5 chapters. They are fractured, gender-blending vignettes. There are different genres. There are poems, letters, postcards, redacted documents, drafts, and imagined dialogues. And this multi-voice collage dismantles conventional narrative and highlights how censorship erases voices. So Shushan, turning to you, as an archaeologist, you turn to topics of history and time, loaning and belonging, losing and acquiring one's language, while creating, but at the same time filling in the gaps, perhaps even creating a counter-archive. And one of your novel's aims, as I understand, is to remember Armenian literary landscape with its forgotten figures. But before proceeding with gaps, I would like to ask you about beginnings. As we know, the thing about changes, turning points, and peripeties, it is that it can be particularly hard to mark their ends and beginnings. So could you please share some memories on how you got the idea to compose such book and what was the writing process like?
Thank you for the introduction, Hannah. Yeah, so this was written a while ago, 2006, many, many years ago. So it's interesting to come back to this book again through the translation. So as Deanna was translating this book, and it has been a long time for the translation, she began translating this while she was doing her master's in University of Ca' Foscari in Venice. She translated and put it aside, and then she came back to it again. And it was in a process of 10 years when finally this book, was published in in English recently. And all of a sudden, there was more interest in this book. And now I'm sort of forced to come back to it in a strange way by way of translation and rethink about what I've done in 2006 when I was writing this. I was writing this in the United States as I was a master's student in English studies and comparative literature. And as I was reading very widely various authors who were inspiring me in various ways. And I was recollecting and thinking who had inspired me earlier on in the Armenian language. And I recalled this name, Shushanik Kurghinian, and I hadn't read much of her work. It was just in a textbook in my 6th or 7th grade, which we had a few poems. We were supposed to read these poems, but the teacher said, she's not important, we can skip her. And so this sort of question remained. Who is this author? Why did we skip her? She was one of the two poets who were women. And I thought, why are we skipping over this author? And anyway, when I was in the United States, I started trying to find out about her work, and I came back to Yerevan and I went into the archives, and I found her archives, which were there. All of her notebooks were there. Everything was there, and I sort of delved into her work. Many were unpublished. Some of them were published. Those had proletarian ideology. These kinds of, that would serve the sort of socialist ideology, the ideology of the Soviet Union. Those were the works that were published. But then there was so much more feminist works that were very, very interesting. Essays, letters, that kind of helped me discover a kind of literature that I never knew that existed in Armenian language. And as I was in the United States, I also was missing or longing for the Armenian. And so the book was written in Armenian in the United States about the city that I was missing and longing about, Yerevan. And so this meeting took place in Yerevan while I was elsewhere. So in a sense, it was projecting my own longing and belonging in a language that I felt a foreigner. Armenian felt foreign and strange to me at the time, especially because I was well versed in Armenian up to my 10th grade. I finished school and I sort of stopped exploring Armenian. I read a lot, but I never really wrote in Armenian. So this was a place for me to translate what I was reading. Many authors, including Viktor Shklovsky's writings, Lynn Heginian's books that I was reading at the time, and sort of getting those in translation into Armenian and then putting them into this book, which was about Shushanik Kurghinian and Zarubyani and their meeting. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it does. So I can then move to the next question. One could notice quite a few gaps in your writing, so to say. For instance, a book which is untitled, a book without a title, or characters left unnamed, or sentences left unfinished or torn apart. How would you describe main functions of gaps in your work? And what could you say about narrative gaps? So that's I'm jumping to the question.
The gaps were the gaps that I wanted to know, for example, why is it that we're skipping over writers in a textbook? The archives were there, but there was the biography that was available in the archives by Kurghinian had many erased lines. So there were parts in her biography that was unavailable. It was there, but I couldn't access it because of a censor or whoever. It could have been Kurghinian herself who crossed out these parts in her biography. Autobiography. So the writers' union, usually in the Soviet era, they would ask the authors to give their biographies. And so either she or the typewriter who typed it up for her, because she would be dictating and someone would be typing it up. So there were parts in her biography that were unknown, gaps that I would have liked to know, and there's no way that I would find out. Even after I found her great-granddaughter, I interviewed her and tried to get a sense about her life, about her legacy, about what she was like as a great-grandmother. So everything was in puzzle pieces. There were various pieces, but then the connections were missing somehow. And so this book helped me put these pieces together, but through my own biography, if you will, which is complete and incomplete at the same time. And all narratives, they have these kinds of gaps. And I just wanted to highlight that there are certain, narratives, as in feminist history, for example, women's histories, women's literature, and their continuity. They have these deliberate fractures, ruptures, that were important for me to explore somehow. And I wanted to imitate that. I wanted to mimic that through my writing. And so I have sentences that are half finished. And so I have passages that are just asterisks, sort of hinting at that certain parts have been censored out. So for example, when Zabel Yesayan, an Ottoman-born writer, came back to Armenia, repatriated to Armenia during the Stalin era, a lot of her whole books were censored, whole books were disappeared in a sense, right? From the publishing houses, from the presses, they just pages disappeared, parts of her biography disappeared. So herself, Zabel Yesayan, disappeared as she was being transferred from one prison to another prison, as she was being sent to the labor camps. Anyway, so these kinds of physical and also epistemological gaps were of interest to me. How do we know these things which we can't know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for your answer. I will then go to another question about how you work with other authors' texts. And I would also like to mention that it's not only in a book Untitled that you include so-called forgotten artists and authors in your text, but also in The Women of Zarubyan Street, you revisit the biography and works of Araksnir Kararyan, a painter who belonged to the third floor artist movement in Yerevan from 1987 to 1994. So when you read a book Untitled, you do not get a feeling of hierarchical quotations, or there's no possibility to guess who or what is being referenced in a particular moment. So it does not create this feeling that something needs to be resolved, or like something needs to be, like the mystery should be solved. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about how you work with other artists. So you already told us about that, but maybe in a more day-to-day sense, like how does does this process take place?
So if we want to move on to the second book, the Women of Zarubyan Street, I won't go deep into that. That's a really complicated, complex book. It plays with various things. The form is very, very much more experimental than this book. But Araksnir Kararyan, in book Untitled, I was dealing with artists who no longer were alive, or writers who were no longer alive. And in the second book, which is also a photographic novel, we have Lucine Talalyan's photographs that are facing the text. I was exploring a living artist and her again disappearance. So she was from the era of Soviet, post-Soviet, this kind of a transitional moment where, so she was working in the 1980s. Then we had the 90s, the independence from the Soviet Union, the sort of collapse of the Soviet Union, and then the early 1990s. And then after that, she was kind of ousted from the scene, which was extremely male-dominated and very sort of antagonistic to women's work. And so she sort of dropped out and completely, went missing in a sense. She changed her course, she stopped painting and sort of went into a very reclusive state. Lusine Talalyan was interested in her work. I didn't know anything about Arax Nerkarayan. So I was interested in Lusine's perspective of and knowledge of this author and her desire to know about her. So my interest was to describe her desire of learning about and sort of finding out about this painter. So it was sort of like a search for this lost painter artist through Lucine's gaze, and that's why we have her photographs there somehow. The text and the photograph, they don't complete one another, or perhaps they do. It's like a dialogue. One is not really describing the other one in a sense. One is talking on its own and the other is speaking on its own, and the reader is asked to make those connections. If you know this, Hannah, you've talked about this earlier, that I do ask the readers to do some work in a sense. I sort of address the reader in a very direct manner, and I ask the reader to imagine things on their own and to fill in the gaps. So this is the kind of thing, again, in the Women of Zarubyan Street, where I'm asking the reader to find those connections between the text and the photograph. There really are no direct connections whatsoever in the text and the image.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think on this note, we can move to the first reading part. And we would like to read from the chapter 3.
Mm-hmm. May I add this about the beginnings to go back to your question?
Sure.
So interestingly, this book Untitled, started with chapter 1.5. That's why it doesn't have a place of its own somehow. The letter to Violette. It started with this letter, and then the rest was built around it somehow. And this is the moment where we're looking at Shushanik Kurghinian's translations, the poems, with the editors, and we're discussing it, of how to translate. What is proper translation? How can we make sense of these poems and get them translated? And so that's the heart of it. It's in some way. That's the hinge of the book. But now we'll be reading from chapter 3. And so I'll be reading the whole chapter, and it's going to be in Armenian. Anyone who knows Armenian in the crowd, in the audience?
It doesn't seem so.
So is this the first time you're hearing Armenian? Perhaps
Yes.
it's in Eastern Armenian. So we have Western Armenian and Eastern Armenian. This is what the standard language in the Republic of Armenia. Most of the diasporan Armenians who come from the Western Turkey, or have sort of come from that part of the homeland, they speak Western Armenian. So this is in Eastern Armenian. Yerek. I guess I need my glasses for this. Երեք հերո թախիծը հոգուս ծաղկոցում։ 1926 թվականի գարնանային մի օր։ Լարա գիրքն ունի երկու նպատակ՝ վերականգնել կորցրածը եւ ստեղծել նորը։ Ինչու է կազմված բացիկներից, հարցնում ես։ Նրանք նստած էին սրճարանում։ Թե որ փողոցի վրա, որ անկյունում ընտրեք ինքներդ։ Օգտագործեք ձեր երևակայությունը, ամեն ինչ չեմ շարադրելու, բայց քաղաքը Երևանն էր։ Իհարկե, գիրքն ունի շատ նպատակներ, սակայն հիմնական նպատակը ուզում եմ քեզ բացիկ ուղարկել, սիրելիս, բայց ոչ մի կերպ չեմ կարողանում ճիշտ մոտեցումը գտնել։ Նա ձեռնափայտով էր եկել, ոտքը շատ ծանր վիճակում էր։ Զաբելը նոթատետրում գրի էր առնում անցուդարձող մարդկանց մասին։ Գիրք, որ չես ուզում ձեռքիցդ վար դնել։ Նա ճերմակ ձեռնոցները դնում է վար ու հայացքը ձգում զապելի գրչին։ Շուշանիկ Կուրղինյան 1898 թվականին Գարեգին Լևոնյանը առաջին թորգոմյան ազգից կշտամբում է, անարգում է իմ գրիչ պահելու բաց է թողնված, ինչպես ասում են ռուսները իմ գրվածքի բաց է թողնված։ Գտնել ճիշտ խոսքերը, լրացնել բացերը, բայց ինչպես վեր գտնել այն, ինչ անհետ կորսված է։ Shushanik Kurghinian. Ես եմ լինելու ռուսահայերիս առաջին կին բանաստեղծուհին։ Լարա, միթե չես տեսնում գրքի բուն նպատակը։ Կենսագրության եւ ինքնակենսագրության տարբերությունն այն է, որ առաջինն ավարտված է, իսկ երկրորդը դեռ գրվում է եւ կարող է փոխել իր ընթացքը ցանկացած վայրկյանին։ Ուրեմն հավանական է, որ գրքի վերնագիրը կարող է լինել ինքնակենսագրություններ։ Զաբել Եսայան. Պոլսում ինձ եւս համոզում էին, որ դասավանդեմ հայ գրականություն, բայց ես այլ նպատակներ ունեի։ Քամին բերում է յասամանների նոր բուրմունքը եւ խառնում անձրևից հետո ծանր փոշու հոտի հետ։ Շուշանիկ Կուրղինյան, բաց է թողնված։ Հետ խոսում եմ համոզված պնդում են, որ իհարկե ես բանաստեղծուհի չեմ լինելու, չեմ եւ չեմ լինելու։ Բայց դուք հարցնում եք ով է հերոսը, ինչ է նրա անունը, որտեղ է կատարվում գործողությունը, ունենալու է այս ամենը ավարտ, բարի ավարտ, որն է գրքի վերնագիրը, հոգիս աքսորյալ, թե ապրելու համար, որոշեք ինքներդ։ Բացի մեկ գրչագրից, մնացած գրեթե բոլոր տետրերը թվագրված են։ 1898 թվականի օգոստոսի 23-ին լույս է տեսնում իմ առաջին բանաստեղծությունը, Գիշերը ձորում։ Շուշանիկ Կուրղինյան. Ես այլ նպատակներ ունեի, Զաբել Եսայան, սակայն երբ եկան ու թակեցին մեր դուռը, Շուշանիկ Կուրղինյան, այդ թվի վերջերին երկաթուղային ժանդարմ Էլը հայտնում է մեզ, որ ինձ լրտեսում են ու իմ անուն նշանակված է մի շարք ձերբակալումների ցուցակում։ Զաբել Եսայան, ես տանը չէի։ Շուշանիկ Կուրղինյան, գնում ենք Ռուսաստան։ Զաբել Եսայան, իսկ հետո մի քանի շաբաթից թաքուն մեկնեցի Բուլղարիա։ Ծովը սիրելիս շատ հանդարտ է սոսկալի փոթորկից առաջ։ Նայում եմ անցուդարձող մարդկանց ու լսում Լարային։ Մայրն ու որդին մնացել էին Պոլսում, ամուսինն ու աղջիկը ապաստանել Փարիզում։ Ըստ գիտական տվյալների արյունն ու ծովաջուրն ունեն ճիշտ նույն մակարդակը։ Դե շուտ իմ նավակ անիծված ծովում չկա հարատև ժպիտ ու գորով։ Նա չուներ երկընտրանք, նա կարող էր միայն գրել, պատմել կատարվածի մասին։ Գրել ապրելու համար գրել։ I think I'll stop here, Hannah, and I'll ask you to read the English translation.
I think it was till the. Could you please tell me till which exact sentence it was?
I think I will probably read up to here in this chapter, but you can read the full chapter in English.
Okay.
Yes?
I see. Can do that as well.
And the translation is by the wonderful Deanna Cachoian-Schanz with the beautiful English that Hannah will read.
So chapter 3, A Distant Sorrow in the Flower Garden of My Soul. One day in the spring of 1926. Lara, the book has two purposes: to recover what's been lost and to create something new. Why is it composed of postcards, you ask? They were sitting in a cafe. On which street, at which corner, figure it out for yourselves. Use your imagination. I'm not going to narrate everything. But the city was Yerevan. Of course, the book has many purposes, but its main purpose is, I want to send you a postcard, my dear, but I can't seem to find the right approach. She came with a walking stick. Her leg was in bad shape. Isabelle was jotting notes down in her notebook about the passers-by. A book you don't want to put down. She takes off her white gloves and fixes her gaze on Isabelle's pen. Shushanik Kurghinian. In 1898, Gergin Levoyan was the first from the Turgaman family to utter a reproach, belittling my omitted text, for holding a pen, as the Russians say, my omitted text, of writing, to find the right words, to fill in the gaps. But how do we uncover what's been lost without a trace? Shushanik Kurghinian. I will be the first Russian-Armenian woman poet. Lara, don't you see this book's main purpose? The difference between biography and autobiography is that the first one is finished and the second one is still being written. Its course can change at any moment. So it's plausible that the book's title could be Autobiographies. Zabeli Sayan. In Bolis, they were also pushing me to teach Armenian literature, but I had other plans. The wind carries in the new scent of lilacs that mixes with the strong smell of dust after the rain. Kurghinian. They talk to, I made a text, and make confident statements about how I'm obviously not and will never be a poet. But you ask, who's the main hero? What's her name? Where does the action take place? Will there be an end to all this? A happy ending? What's the book title? My Soul in Exile or To Live? Decide for yourselves. With the exception of one manuscript, almost all of the Romanian notebooks are dated. My first poem, At Night in the Valley, was published on August 23rd, 1898. Kurghinian. I had other plans too. Yes, I am. But when they came and knocked on our door, Kurghinian. At the end of that year, the railway gendarme, L, told us that they were spying on me and that my name was on their arrest list. Isayan. I wasn't at home. Kurghinian. We're going to Russia. Isayan. And a few weeks later, I snuck into Bulgaria. The sea, my dear, is very calm before the storm. I'm watching the passerby and listening to Lara. Her mother and son stayed in Bolis, and her husband and daughter took refuge in Paris. According to the science, blood and seawater share the exact same density. Hurry on, my little boat. No smile or tenderness lasts for long in this accursed sea. She had no other option. She could only write and tell about what had happened. Write to live, live to write. It's dark, my friend, and this endless path will never end. I feel so tired, my sick soul, weak and unfeeling. Let me spread my book out beneath your buildings, let it touch your shins. Let me write about love. Disentangle yourself and disentangle me. There is one purpose, which is to deviate from the original purpose. I'll try and start again. Lara, someone once said, one doesn't love again, but loves anew. To comprehend something new, one must learn another language, customs, culture. In a word, they must live another way of life. Outcast pilgrim, parentheses are like borders, cross them and you'll find. Kurghinian. Who are they? I ask a goggle lookalike. The Russian proletariat, he says with a snicker. They've called a strike to fight for 8-hour workdays, and for the managers of the factory to address them formally. Imagine that. Adorn me in yellow, orange, and bright red. It's for you, but not only for you. Nostalgia is more torturous in spring. Reader, you are inscrutable, but you scrutinize me. You are dark, but you illuminate my nights. You are silent, but concerned for me. You know, but you don't confide. You are far away, yet touch my pages. You are familiar, but you reject me. It's hard to get used to something new, but it's necessary to try. Kurghinian. On May 1st, I was carried away by the blue flood, and a few days later, Isabel examines her face intently. Isayan. A few days later, I was a witness to a horrible scene. Setting a purpose is easy, it's accomplishing it that's difficult. Close your eyes. Imagine one April day when the lilacs are blooming on the green bushes and the sparrows are sprightly again. Isayan. Bodies in damp ditches. Isayan. Mutilated bodies. Isayan. I, child of the East, had only seen suns there in the days of my childhood. Suns, red and blazing, suns whose rays reached deep inside me, penetrating my bones until they reached my heart. The book's title is Reincarnation. That's more appropriate. Forgive me, reader. And I'm someone who doesn't like making corrections. Don't cross it out, just write it over with a pencil. I'm drawing a newly opened pomegranate flower on this page of the book. A song for the night. My dear sister, let me kneel before your anguish, me, a constant captive of dissolute pleasure. Let me take a bright spark from your hopes and give light to my thoughts abandoned in the night. It was here that I read her lines for the first time. It was here that I understood the meaning of a strange heritage. It was here that I cried helplessly. Your eyes have grown dim, your pulse speaks the languages of the Arctic Ocean, the coffin holding your body shrouded with malice. Around you dance mournful beauties in black veils and braid your majestic hair with their dainty fingers. And now at this almighty hour, how can I not be afraid? How can I not doubt that my 1,000-year-old curs have become old from waiting in their jars? How can I not tremble in excitement to feel the weight of your hands once more on my alienated skin, grown wild and scarred from the breath of my own nails? Tell me, how can I, my beautiful? Few understood our death, few remember our history, few have seen our resurrection. Read Verujan's The Red Soil now. Read Siamanto's Vision of Death today. Stand on the shores of Euphrates and read Zartarian's Nostalgias in Foreigners. Read them all on this moonless night.
Thank you, Hannah. Shall we read the next chapter, or do you want to maybe proceed with some questions?
Yeah, I would like to ask some questions so that I don't talk that much. Or yeah, so again, in The Women of Zarubyan Street, you write that the text is, and I'm quoting, composed entirely of citations, which recount events that have taken place either in reality or in the imagination. That's the end of quote. And I find it interesting because I think we're used to thinking that a citation's main use is to testify to something which indeed happened, to be a proof of something which have taken place in the real world, so to say, and then you write a citation of imagination. So I was wondering, what do you think about the nature of citation? Where does it belong to? So could you please tell more about that?
So specifically for that book, for Zarubyan Street Women,
No,
or in general.
In general, but you can also through this book answer.
Yeah. So I kind of see myself again, not so much as a writer, but I guess a translator. And so a translator uses the original material somehow. And since I was not really interested in a project that would be an academic project in which you have, the citations which are clearly stated whose citations these are, this sort of documentation of citations, and then the analysis of those citations. I was more interested in sort of letting those citations speak for themselves, and also blurring who said what, because in the aftermath, when we have a bunch of people, for instance, so in the Zarubyan Street Women, we have these various people who are coming together and they're producing something together collectively. There, it seems to me that the application of who said what was immaterial, not important to me. I was not really interested in having that, but I was interested in translating what they were saying in my own words. So that's where it's sort of everything is a citation, including in a book Untitled. I am using Zabel Yesayan's quotations, but then I'm filling in the rest with my own endings or beginnings. So if I have fragments that I'm quoting or I'm citing, then it's sandwiched with my own imagination. So it is documentary, but at the same time, it is fictional. And it's in those parts when I don't have a full complete picture. And so this is where my own projection would come in and complete the picture somehow, a very much self-projected way.
Yeah, I also have some questions about translation, and I would like to ask them still, though we kind of touched upon that. You already mentioned about Eastern and Western Armenian, and you've written the novel, a book in Armenian, and Deanna translated it into English, but it seems that the novel remains potentially multilingual. So could you maybe tell more about the languages of the book? But I also have a question about translating trauma. I don't know, maybe we can combine them together about how do we read about traumatic experience and how do you narrate the non-narratable? Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you find
So
the language for it?
So I'll start with Zabel Yesayan's text, which is called Among the Ruins, which she wrote during the Cilician massacre. She was asked to go to witness what had remained after the massacres, and so she was sent with a group of patriarchs to just go and record what she was seeing, to witness basically. And as she went, she was compelled to write about this, and she was writing in the genre of novel writing or story writing, fiction. And this was her first book in which she's documenting. And so she's witnessing, and she has these descriptions of where she's interviewing people who've basically survived a few days before they've survived something atrocious. Children survived or orphans. So she's going to these houses where these children who've been orphaned, who've been abused, who've been traumatized, who've been sexually abused, who've witnessed the murder of their parents. And so she's interviewing them. And all of her text is in Western Armenian, and it's full of ellipses. Her questions are ending in ellipses. The responses are beginning with ellipses, middle ellipses, ending ellipses. Sometimes there are no words, they're just mumblings, and they're just sounds that are in the text, right? So, and I've written about this, the translation into English. Zabel Yesayan's works began to be translated again very recently. Recently, most of her important works have been translated into English, and I believe in French as well, and possibly in other languages. But so the translator, interestingly, again, an Armenian who knew Western Armenian very well, translated and eliminated more than half of the ellipses. So the ellipses is a very important way of communicating this kind of fracture, emotion, inability to communicate. And that's exactly what, trauma does. You want to tell, there is this urge to tell, but you can't find the language to express what has happened. There is a fracture, there's a fragment. You're ashamed to speak, you have no words to say, all you can do is sob. And so there is a lot of that's present in her text, and that in the translation it is completely rationalized. It has been completely domesticated to the rational way of thinking, right? So this person utters something, and then there is a full stop, or there's a comma. It's not fractured, it's not fragmented by the ellipses, the speechlessness, something that is unsayable. So this kind of, translating traumatic experience into languages is extremely difficult, to utter things and then to write it down, to witness this in writing. Language is somehow witnessing all of that, right? And so I think that for me, it was interesting to study, first of all, how the literature that was produced in response to, the genocide. I've studied that. I've looked at how texts have been written in Armenian or in English, or how have been then translated into another language. And you see how there's a lot of meaning that is lost and is rationalized and disciplined and placed into, palatable, digestible forms. Whereas there are authors who write in such a manner, like Michelina Harunyan-Markham, the Armenian-American writer who's written a trilogy on the genocide, and then she's proceeded to write other novels. But she always returns to this traumatic experience, and the saying or the expressing of it, or the impossibility of expressing it. And she plays with the text in that way, where she imitates this kind of fragmentation, fracturing, and silencing yourself somehow. I don't do a whole lot of that in book Untitled. I don't explore it as much as I should have, I guess. But in Zarubyan Street Women, language does break down, and the Armenian becomes very, very complicated and very sort of it creates its own language somehow. Toward the end, Zarubyan Street Women begins in a very sort of rational way, and then slowly it deteriorates into parenthetical, fragmented statements in which I'm somehow exploring the trauma of this generation who went through the collapse of the Soviet Union and the shock and the trauma that we've experienced as a generation, a lost generation somehow, that was really unable to find out a consistency, a ground, a common ground, and a very sort of sure future somehow, something that the post-independence generation was able to find. But we have the sort of, duality, being in two places, seeing one world and then seeing the creation of another world. And there has been the split. So there is a split of identity, a split of belonging, so something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for your answer. I actually think, looking at the time, that we can read another chapter before opening the floor for discussion.
Sure. Yes. So we're reading from 18, yes? Chapter 18.
Mm-hmm.
I'll do the same again. I'll read maybe up to half of the chapter. I won't read the whole chapter because it will, it's a bit long. So I'll read part of it so that we can hear the sound and then we can hear the translation. You're marvelous reading. Thank you. You're a beautiful reader. I love hearing how the text sounds in someone else's reading. But 18 անցածս անապատում ջուր չկար։ Ամենաանտանելին գիշերն է, երբ հրամայում են բոլոր լույսերը մարել։ Իմ սիրելի աղջիկ, գրում եմ ինքնակենսագրական մի վեպ առաջին գրքիս շարունակությունը։ Այն սկսվում է 1915 թվականից։ Գրքի սևագիրն արդեն համարյա պատրաստ է։ Նախնական վերնագիրը կարծես թե հնչելու է այսպես. Զավեշտական աքսոր։ Վերակացուներից մեկն ինձ խոստացավ փոխանցել այն քեզ։ Փորձիր տպել Փարիզում, ընկեր Գրիգորյանցի տպարանում։ Մթության միջից հազիվ տեսանելի գնացքի ուրվագիծը դանդաղ ու ծանր շառաչյունով մոտենում է կայարանին ու գոլորշու քուլաներ արձակելով կանգ առնում։ Զինվորական հագուստով վագոնավարը բացում է դուռն ու մեկ առ մեկ ներս ուղեկցում կայարանում շարված մարդկանց։ Սև հագուստով ու գլխարկով կինը մի փոքրիկ ճամփորդական պայուսակ ձեռքին մտնում է իրեն հատկացված վագոնը ու տեղավորվում պատուհանի մոտ։ Պայուսակից հանում է օրվա թերթն ու ընկղմվում ընթերցանության մեջ։ Մթության միջից հազիվ տեսանելի գնացքի ուրվագիծը դանդաղ ու ծանր շառաչյունով մոտենում է կայարանին ու գոլորշի քուլաներ արձակելով կանգ առնում։ Կապույտ համազգեստով վագոնավարը բացում է դուռն ու մեկ առ մեկ ներս ուղեկցում կայարանում հավաքված մարդկանց։ Սև շալվարով ու փողկապով կինը ճամպրուկը ձեռքին մտնում է վագոններից մեկն ու նստում ազատ նստարանին։ Ճամպրուկի գրպանից հանում է պատճենահանված թղթերի մի կապոց ու սկսում ուշադրությամբ զննել դրանց պարունակությունը։ 2-1 գնացքում 1916 թվական։ Չտպագրված ինքնակենսագրական ակնարկ։ Ես մեղավոր եմ ինձ զգում, երբ անդրադառնում եմ Նշանյանի խոսքերին։ Մեղավոր եմ, որ 4 տարի շարունակ չեմ կարողանում որևէ այլ բանի մասին մտածել։ Կարծես թե այս գնացքը շարժվում է ժամանակից ու աշխարհագրությունից դուրս, եւ այդ իսկ պատճառով անհնար է չափել նրա ընթացքի արագությունը։ Պատուհանից ձգվում է անծայրածիր ստեպը։ Չնայած որ ամեն անգամ գնացք նստելուց լցվում եմ նորի ակնկալման զգացմունքով, միևնույն ժամանակ հոգիս ձգտում է ծանոթ տեսարաններին։ Այս ահռելի ստեպում հանկարծակի առանց որևէ զգուշացման Հեշտությամբ կարելի է կորցնել մեկի կյանքն ու նպատակները։ Այստեղ կարելի է չփնտրել ու գտնել մեկի անժամանակ ավարտը։ Yeah, I think I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. I will just put some water. Chapter 18. There was no water in the desert I crossed. Most unbearable is the night when they order all lights out. My dear daughter, I'm writing an autobiographical novel, the continuation of my first book. It begins in 1915. The rough draft of the book is almost ready, and I think the working title will be Comedic Exile. One of the guards promised me that he'd secretly pass it to you. Try to publish it in Paris at Comrade Krukarian's publishing house. Out of the darkness, the silhouette of a faintly visible train slowly, clankingly approaches the station, and letting out steam comes to a halt. The conductor, dressed in a soldier's garb, opens the door and one by one ushers the people lined up in the station onto the train. A woman in black clothes and a hat, holding a small traveler's bag, enters the train car and settles near the window. She takes a daily paper out of a bag and immerses herself in reading. Out of the darkness, the silhouette of a faintly visible train slowly, clankingly approaches the station and, letting out steam, comes to a halt. The conductor, dressed in a blue uniform, opens the door and one by one ushers the people lined up in the station into the train. A woman in black pants and a necktie, holding a suitcase in her hand, enters one of the cars and sits in an empty seat. From the pocket of her suitcase, she takes out a stack of photocopies and starts to carefully examine its contents. 2-1 on the train, 1916. An unpublished autobiographical essay. I feel guilty when I think back on Nishanyan's words. I'm guilty because for 4 continuous years I haven't been able to think about anything else. It's as if this train were moving out of time and space, and for that reason it's impossible to measure the speed of its progress. The endless steps sprawls outside the window. It makes no difference that each time I sit in a train car, I'm filled with a new feeling of anticipation. At the same time, my soul gravitates towards familiar sights. Suddenly, without warning, one can easily lose sight of their life and purpose in this vast step. Here, one might not seek but find their untimely end. Out of the darkness, the silhouette of a faintly visible train slowly and heavily slithers through the desert. One of the train cars carries political prisoners. The one sitting by the window is writing. My heart gets tight with a strange and incomprehensible feeling. It's impossible to explain this passage. This train car filled with strangers passing along the edge of the world of obscurity. Hour after hour, the train stops and the conductor heads new groups of people aboard. Their silent faces are riddled with the same expression of infinite despair. It seems we've already resigned to our fate. It seems that the country has entered a sad era, and it seems that I'm embodying it. You can find any word you wish in a dictionary, but brilliant writers write in different languages simultaneously. Or, as Walter Benjamin would say, they're searching for a pure language that embodies all languages. Her book begins in Skutari, in the neighborhood called the Gardens of Siligda. However, the writer doesn't present it as someone who's seen deportation, persecutions, death, powerlessness, or disappointment, that is, as someone who's seen life, but rather as a child who's seeing and feeling for the first time, that is, with new eyes. To see and assess things on one's own terms. And what gives the book that uniqueness is the writer's masterful rendition of precise and unexpectedly raw details. In this way, for example, she presents story of a father and daughter, a relationship in a world all their own, the sustenance and beauty of which is revealed in the following line. The steamboat rocked from side to side as it passed through the Marmara. My father and I were sitting and talking on one of the benches along the side of the deck. The book is unfinished, or more precisely finishes with that trip. Where is this train of thought taking me? I don't know, but nevertheless the train continues its march. The journey that began in the green gardens of Siligda and passed through the literary salons of Constantinople, Cairo's orphanages, Paris universities, the brilliant minds of Yerevan and Stalin's concentration camps, all the time heading towards the steps of eternity.